Hey there, I'm Nick Bolton, the founder of ICCS, and today we're going to look at the question of what's the difference between coaching and coaching supervision in terms of how it's done and what it looks at. You see, what I've noticed over the years is because supervision requires high-level experience from a coach to become a supervisor, one of the questions they naturally have is, well, why do I need to train as a supervisor? I'm an experienced coach. I've got a wealth of experience. I know how to coach people. Why do I need supervision? Well, the reason why somebody would need to train as a supervisor is because the skill is different. It's related but different. And I want to explore with you in what way specifically. So first of all, we can start off with the most basic thing that makes it different, which is what you're actually looking at, which is in coaching, you're pretty much looking at whatever the client brings to you, governed by the contract. Now that contract, if it's set up between you and the client, then it's open-ended. If it's set up between a third party, then of course it might be in some way constrained in terms of the subject. But nonetheless, coaching looks at what the client brings you. Now supervision does the same, except it's always predicated on the idea you're looking at some aspect of their professional work. You're not looking at their life in general. You might look at their life in general, but only in as much as it relates to how does that impact the work. So just as a sort of starting point, let's establish that coaching supervision is about looking at the professional work of the person in front of you. Now, that in itself doesn't mean you need training. You might say, well, that's fine. I can do that using coaching. I can ask questions. I can hold space. No problem. I can help that person focus on, and by the way, I can even give them good advice based on what I've seen over the years of being a coach. Great. But it doesn't stop there. What we notice is one of the biggest journeys for a coach when they go from coach to coaching supervisor is the ability to look systemically. Now, of course, I'm aware that systemic coaching exists and some people are being trained as systemic coaching, but on the whole, most coaches are looking at the person in front of them as the focal point. In other words, hey client, what's happening for you? How are you feeling? What do you want? How are you going to achieve it? What could get in your way? And so on and so on. We're looking at that person. When we become a supervisor, we have to spread our wings. I often talk to my supervisor students that they have to learn to spread their wings across a much wider landscape, because we're no longer looking only at the person in front of us. We have a responsibility as supervisors for what you might think of as the whole system of the coaching profession and the relationship that that person in front of you represents within that. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, when you're supervising this person here, they in turn are then coaching somebody here. As a supervisor, you're responsible for that relationship in the sense of not responsible for it, but you are keenly aware of it and your responsibility for this person's outcomes as much as this person's. So you might be noticing that the coach is happy, but the client doesn't seem to be getting what they want. And now in coaching, you might be like, that ain't my problem. That person's my problem. In supervision, it is your problem. You're looking at, well, hold on, what does the client want to get from this? And are they getting it? And how is your behavior supporting or not supporting the client to get what they want? You're supervising not just the well-being of the person in front of you, but the well-being and outcomes of the person at the end of that chain. But it goes beyond that, because you're also looking at, well, what's the system within which this works? Who's paid for this coaching? It could be an organization, it could be a charity, it could be a public sector body, it could be the client themselves, but who's paying for it and what system surrounds it? But also, what's the professional system that's impacting it? How is the governing body of that particular coach impacting the coaching in some way? How is the ICF or the EMCC or the AC or whatever it is that person's part of impacting that coaching for good or bad or neutral? But it's all part of a system. So then one of the things we need to get good at as coach supervisors is feeling into the system. And we start to use ourselves as what I might think of as a tuning fork for the system, and noticing what am I experiencing here, potentially as a result of this system unfolding in front of me. And we call this parallel process. Now, that's not something that you typically learn as a coach. If you do psychodynamic coaching, perhaps you do, but typically most coaches don't learn about parallel process. It's a particular skill to think to yourself, this feeling I've got, where is it coming from? Is it mine? Or does it feel like it's been displaced from somewhere else? And if it's been displaced from somewhere else, what does it tell us about that somewhere else? So this idea of working systemically becomes a big stretch for many coaches, and a liberating stretch. One of the words that gets used so much by coaches when they become supervisors is it felt so liberating. Now, why does it feel liberating? Number one is the scale of what you're looking at. But number two, there's something else we haven't touched on yet, which is the styles of intervention within supervision, which are different, although related, to coaching. Now, one way of looking at this is through the framework provided by John Heron in his book, Helping the Client. In that book, he identifies what he calls 6 categories of intervention. And those 6 categories of intervention are broken down into 2 families, the authoritative family and the facilitative family. In the facilitative family, you have ones that might be highly recognizable for coaches. And the first one is the catalytic intervention, in which we are looking to catalyze new ideas by asking questions, by reflecting, by paraphrasing, by asking simple questions like what else. That's catalyzing. It's the catalytic intervention. Then there's the cathartic intervention, which we don't tend to use in coaching very often, but it's the, let's call it, deliberate enabling of the release of emotions. And then we have the supportive intervention, which we certainly do use in coaching, where we acknowledge what it must be like to feel something, or we acknowledge the progress somebody has made. So that's facilitative. But then in the authoritative, you have the prescriptive intervention, where it's my job to tell you something. Then there's the informative intervention, where I'm going to share some information with you that could be useful. Now, that's not something that happens in coaching very often. It can do in certain fields of coaching, but in humanistic coaching, typically it doesn't. And then finally, there's the confronting intervention, where in some way I hold the mirror up to you to say, look, this is you. This is how you're showing up, or this is what your behavior's done, or whatever it might be. Now, that's something, again, that coaches can do, but often shy away from. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, what I've noticed over the years is once a coach who becomes a coach supervisor starts to embrace these 6 interventions, they feel like they're liberated from the constraints of the primary coaching approach, which is the catalytic intervention. They suddenly realize, wow, this information I've been holding based on my experience is worthwhile here. It's valuable. I can use it. Now, I'm not saying that never happens in coaching, but it's often frowned upon in coaching, and certain schools of coaching within the humanistic field certainly would disavow the idea of certainly prescription and potentially even the informative approach. But in supervision, it's not only allowed, it's an important component. And so coaches find themselves liberated to be much more expressive in not only what they know and how they evoke things, but also what they believe to be true, done in collaboration with that supervisee. So we have no authority over that supervisee beyond what we agree together. No real authority. But what we can do is then have the conversation based on what we've agreed, which is, hey, I'm a supervisor. It is my job to point this out, but it's your job to decide what you do with it. So we have a full range of John Heron's 6 categories of intervention, which is a very, very powerful and liberating process to work with. So at this point, hopefully beginning to get a sense of, okay, there's a journey to go on from being a coach that primarily asks questions and reflects and catalyzes through those little moments of awareness raising, to becoming a supervisor in which you are using a full range of interventions. Now, the irony, of course, is your scope has become smaller, because your scope is now the professional work of the person in front of you rather than whatever issue they bring to you. But the way you work has widened. So let's bring this to a conclusion. Why would you need to train to be a supervisor? Well, number one, you don't have to. Like coaching, like psychotherapy, this is not a regulated profession. If you want to call yourself a supervisor and you believe you've got the experience to do a good job, you can do that. Nobody can stop you. But like I've always said about becoming a coach, the issue with becoming a coach and supervisor is, in terms of training, is not that now you're allowed to do it, is that you can do it well. So hopefully by now you've got some idea of how coaching, supervision, and coaching differ. And if you are thinking of becoming a coach and supervisor, I highly recommend you at least check out whether training as one is an important part of your journey. I believe it is. I know that when I became a supervisor for the first time, it blew my mind how different it was from what I thought I'd been doing as a supervisor, self-taught. It takes you on a whole new journey. So if you're thinking to become a supervisor or you want to use supervision, please consider training, because it is a very different skill, or at least it's an expanded skill with a reduced focus than coaching. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one.